Hi guys, it's Mr. Westner, and we're going to continue looking at the earliest settlers of Pennsylvania. Last time we talked about three groups of native people that lived here. Do you remember all three? The furthest back was the Paleo Indians, then the Archaic Indians, and then most recently would have been the Woodland Indians. Now, our timeline today, we're going to talk more about those Woodland Indians today. Their time period started about 3,000 years ago. Today, we're looking, though, only 500 to 300 years ago. So we've gotten much, much closer to our modern time period. We're looking at about 1500, the year 1500, to about the year 1700 as we're looking at this section. So much more recent time in history. This is the time when Europeans were starting to arrive in North America. I said 1500, the year 1500 would have been 500 years ago. Well, Christopher Columbus made his first sailing in 1492, even though he never made it to the mainland United States. That kind of started that age of exploration, and other explorers soon came after him in the 1500s and explored other areas, including parts of the United States. And then we had the first permanent European settlement coming here in 1607 with Jamestown in Virginia. So all of this time period is what we're looking at here. Pennsylvania was officially founded in 1681. So we're looking through that time period here as we look at the time of the Eastern Woodland Indians in Pennsylvania. This was their time here. Our vocab words here include a lot of words you're probably not as familiar with. We have culture, which I'm sure you've heard of, but then we also have wigwam, longhouse, and wampum. Okay, so three terms you may not be as familiar with there. The vocab strategy deals with compound words like longhouse. It says when you read a compound word, think about the meaning of the two smaller words. A longhouse is a long building in which several families live. That's a longhouse, okay? Just like it sounds. Okay, I really like the build on what you know paragraph because I want you to think about this. It says build on what you know. Do you speak the same language as the people near you? Do you speak the same language as your neighbors? Do you speak the same language if you visit Pittsburgh? Would you speak the same language as most of the people there? Excuse me. Well, it says most of the early American Indians in present-day Pennsylvania spoke the same language as the people near them. They spoke one of two main languages. So in Pennsylvania, 500 years ago, there were two main languages being spoken. Okay? Well, there are different languages spoken here in Pennsylvania today by different people that come from different backgrounds, but it's pretty clear the main language in our area is English. There aren't two main languages, and even in areas where other languages are spoken, I wouldn't have a very hard time finding someone who speaks English. So if I would travel to Philadelphia, if I would travel to Erie, if I would travel to Scranton, these different areas of Pennsylvania, I'm not going to have a hard time finding someone who speaks the same language as me. But in the years 1500, that may have been more of a challenge. But I want you to think about why. Okay? Let's say I decided I was ready to go to Disney World. It would take me about 2 hours on a plane to get to Disney World from here. Now, I would have to drive somewhere with a bigger airport, so I might drive to Pittsburgh, I might drive to Baltimore. But once I get to those places, I can be in Disney in a couple hours. Okay? I could be really halfway around the earth in less than a day. There is nowhere on earth that I couldn't get to, or no country on earth really, that I couldn't get to within a day if I needed to. Okay, if I really wanted to, I could be there pretty easily. So with modern transportation, that makes a big difference. Think about 1500. If a Native American is living near where Philadelphia is today, and another group of Native Americans were living where Pittsburgh is today, how long is it going to take one to get to the other? What's their form of travel? They're probably traveling on foot. Horses were just barely being introduced here in the 1500s. So Native Americans didn't have any form of transportation at that time other than traveling on foot. So it would take weeks for a Native American from Philadelphia to travel to Pittsburgh. There is nowhere on earth today that it would take me weeks to get to, okay, if I really wanted to get there. because I could buy a plane ticket. So at that time, they might go their entire lives living in the same state and never visiting the other parts of the state. Excuse me again. Okay. So those two main languages, as we continue reading, we're going to be looking at that. Now I want you to think again here too. Think about the groups that you are a part of in Pennsylvania. Okay. First of all, you're an American. Okay, right? You live in the United States of America. So you're an American. And we can consider that kind of our big main group. Okay? But some smaller groups that you're a part of, well, you're an American, but you're also a Pennsylvanian because you live in Pennsylvania. Okay? And we can narrow it down even further. And again, I'm speaking specifically here to the people that live in my area and might be in my class. So we live in, what's Pennsylvania broken into? So we have our country that's broken into states. We have our states that are broken into smaller groups called counties. Okay, so you're an American, but you're also a Pennsylvanian. You're also a Blair Countyan. Okay, and then beyond that, in Blair County, there's a lot of different communities. So you might be from Bellwood. You might be from Williamsburg. For us that go to Foot of 10 Elementary, we're most of us from Duncansville. So most of you are Duncansvillians, but there's a few people that live in Hollidaysburg that go to Foot of 10. There's a few people that live in Portage that go to Foot of 10. So there's different communities. So you might be in one of those other groups there as well. But there's other groups that could still be considered Americans. There are Virginians. There are Louisianans. There are Montanans. So there's all these different groups that would consider themselves in that big group called Americans, even though they couldn't fit into the group called Pennsylvanians. There's a lot of Pennsylvanians that wouldn't fit into our little Blair Countyan group. So there are Pennsylvanians that are from Allegheny County near Pittsburgh. There are Pennsylvanians from Adams County near Gettysburg. Pennsylvanians from Bedford County, not far from us, or Cambria County. So there's all these different little parts that would fit together. And that's kind of what we're looking at here. And I'm going to show you that with our Native American groups because they're all Eastern Woodland Indians. That's our big group. They're all part of the Eastern Woodland Indians group. But then there's these smaller groups, these different language groups of Native Americans. And we're going to focus on two main ones that made up Pennsylvania. But there were some other ones as well, that other groups that were living here at the time too. Okay. Early Pennsylvania Indians, and if you're following along in your ebook, this is going to be page 14 in chapter 1, lesson 3. Early American Indian groups shared similar cultures within language groups. So the groups that spoke the same language had a similar culture, and culture is one of our vocab words, so we'll get to what that means here in just a moment. The northeastern part of the present-day United States has long been home to American Indian groups. This area is called the Eastern Woodlands. By 1500, many groups of people had settled in this area. Each group had its own culture. A culture is a way of life that people share. Most of these peoples spoke one of two types of languages. Some spoke an Algonquin language. Okay? So one of the two languages is Algonquin. Okay? Others spoke a Haudenosaunee language. Haudenosaunee groups have also been called Iroquois. Okay? So we have Algonquin and Haudenosaunee, and then just to make it a little more confusing, the Haudenosaunee have two names. Some people call them Haudenosaunee, that's what they referred to themselves as, but they were also sometimes called Iroquois. Okay? So Algonquin and Haudenosaunee / Iroquois are two of our main groups. We're going to focus mainly today on the Algonquin, and then next time when we come back, we'll look at the Haudenosaunee. Algonquin on page 15. The main idea here says that Algonquin groups in Pennsylvania included the Lenni Lenape and the Shawnee. So there were two main Algonquin groups in Pennsylvania. So we had those two main groups. Okay, think about it again like Americans, Eastern Woodland Indians. Pennsylvanians could be considered like Algonquin and Haudenosaunee. And then when we start to narrow it down into smaller groups, there are smaller groups of Algonquin. Two of those groups were the Lenni Lenape and the Shawnee. Now, Algonquin people didn't only live in Pennsylvania. They lived in other areas of the East as well. One of the earliest Algonquin groups to live in what is present-day Pennsylvania was the Lenni Lenape. Lenni Lenape means original people. The Lenni Lenape were also called the Delaware because they lived along the Delaware River. So this is in far eastern Pennsylvania, that Atlantic coastal plain area near Philadelphia. Most Lenni Lenape settled in one place for a long period of time. They lived in communities of related families. Women were very important in Lenni Lenape communities. When a man married, he moved into his wife's home. So the women were the leaders in these tribes, in these Lenni Lenape tribes. It was the women who were in charge. The women were very, very respected figures, and they would be the ones who were the decision makers. They were the ones who were sort of in charge. When a man got married, they would move to their wife's home. It was the wife that kind of was the head of the family in these Lenni Lenape communities. Lenni Lenape communities usually included several houses called wigwams. A wigwam was a small round house made of bark with a dome-shaped roof. And one of the videos I'm going to share with you here is going to show how a wigwam would have been built. It's a modern reconstruction of a wigwam, but it kind of gives you an idea of how the native people would have done that. And if you look at the wigwam behind me, it kind of looks like the shape of another type of native house. We'd normally think of this in a colder climate. Doesn't it kind of look like an igloo? So it was a very common style of home. It was a very effective style of home because it was very easy to heat. What you would do with that wigwam is you would actually build a fire in the middle of the floor, and then from that fire, the smoke would go straight up because there's no wind blowing it, you're inside. The fire would go straight up and out a hole in the roof, or the smoke rather. So that was a very easy way to keep that home warm. And then that dome shape, it would just heat the entire building pretty easily. The floor would have been a dirt floor. It's not like there was anything on the floor that would catch on fire. You wouldn't have a floor with anything except the dirt on the ground. So you would just clear the land and then build that wigwam right on top of it. Lenni Lenape grew crops such as beans, corn, and squash. They sometimes ground and boiled corn to make soup, bread, and dumplings. We're going to pause here because I want to tell you a story. I want to tell you the story of the three sisters. Corn, beans, and squash were considered three related crops. They were called the three sisters by the Native Americans, and they were very, very important. They grew them together. So they would dig one hole, they would plant corn, beans, and squash all together, and then they would help one another. So here is that story.
Once upon a time, there were three sisters. The first sister was very tall and strong. Her name was Corn Girl, and she wore a pale green dress and had long yellow hair that blew in the wind. Corn Girl liked to stand straight and tall, but the hot sun burned her feet and hurt her. And the longer Corn Girl stood in her field, the hungrier she got. And every day more weeds were growing up around her and choking her. Now I want you to imagine, what's corn like? Well, here's a picture. Corn grows very tall and straight, so Corn Girl liked to stand straight and tall, but the hot sun burned her feet and hurt her, so it's burning the bottom parts of the corn. She wore a pale green dress. Think about the husk on the corn. She had long yellow hair that blew in the wind. Think about the silk that comes out of the corn. If you've ever had corn on the cob and husked the corn, that's kind of what we're talking about here. Every day, more and more weeds were growing up around her and choking her, so the weeds are kind of taking over. So that's corn, and they're describing how corn grows. The Native Americans enjoyed making up legends and stories to explain things. You may have heard the expression pourquoi tales before. So this idea of explaining things through their stories, through their legends, that's kind of what we have here. So that's the story. That's the Corn Girl part of the story. The second sister was very thin and quick and fast, and her name was Bean Girl. but she wasn't very strong. She couldn't even stand up on her own. She was good at making food, but she just had to lie there stretched out on the ground, and she would get dirty and wet, which wasn't good for her. If you've ever seen bean plants, that's kind of what they do. And bean plants today, usually a lot of times, gardeners who grow them, they have different types of trellises or different structures to help hold them up and support them. So that's kind of what we're looking at with the beans. The third sister, Squash Girl, was short and stocky and wore a yellow dress. She was hungry too. And squash, we have many kinds of squash. There's yellow squash, there's butternut squash. Pumpkins are a type of squash, and they grow very low to the ground. They are kind of a shorter, stockier fruit when they grow. The leaves are large and broad. They do turn yellow as time goes by. They also usually produce a yellow flower as well. So we have our description of our three sisters, corn, beans, and squash. For a long time, the sisters didn't get along. They each wanted to be independent and free and not have anything to do with the other two. So Corn Girl stood there with her sunburned feet and got hungrier and hungrier. And Bean Girl lay there on the ground and got dirtier and wetter. And the little sister Squash Girl was hungry too. So Bean Girl talked to her sister Corn Girl and said, "What if I feed you some good food, and you can hold me up so I don't have to lie on the ground and get all dirty?" And Corn Girl thought that was a great idea. Then little Squash Girl called up to her tall sister, "How about if I lie on your feet and shade them so you won't get sunburned?" Corn Girl thought that was a great idea too. So the three sisters learned to work together so that everyone would be healthier and happier. Corn Girl helped Bean Girl stand up. Bean Girl fed Corn Girl and Squash Girl good food, and Squash Girl shaded Corn Girl's feet and kept the weeds from growing up around them all. And that's why the Haudenosaunee and Algonquin people planted their corn, their beans, and their squash together in the same field. The three sisters. And that's what a three sisters garden would look like when those crops were planted all together. The squash shading the corn, and it's hard to see, but the corn is supporting the beans, and they can kind of crawl up those corn stalks. So a pretty clever way of planting that was originally developed by the Algonquin and Haudenosaunee people long, long ago.
They hunted animals such as ducks, bears, turkeys, and deer. All of those animals are still very common in Pennsylvania, still very popular game animals in Pennsylvania. The Lenni Lenape also gathered nuts, berries, and mushrooms. So even though they were better farmers than their ancestors had been, they still used the food that nature gave them naturally. They wouldn't just stop taking those berries and nuts and things that were growing, mushrooms. They would continue to use those things that their ancestors had used thousands of years ago. Religion was an important part of Lenni Lenape life. They believed in a creator who made the universe. In the late 1600s, an Algonquin group called the Shawnee moved into present-day Pennsylvania. The Shawnee did not settle in one place for long. They lived in temporary villages. Now, maybe some of you have visited Shawnee State Park. Shawnee State Park is in Bedford County, Pennsylvania. There's a large lake there. There's some cabins there, I believe, some trails. So very nice park, but it is named for the Shawnee Indians, the Shawnee Native Americans that once lived in the area. The Shawnee lived in temporary villages. In warm months, the Shawnee planted and harvested corn, pumpkins, and other crops. In colder months, the Shawnee set up villages in forests. Why do you think they did that? Why would they be kind of out in the open areas during the warmer months and then in the forests during the winter? Well, sometimes people tell me that because it gets cold in the winter, okay, because they need warmth. Well, if I'm in the woods in the winter, am I really warmer than I am if I'm sitting out in a meadow? Maybe I don't feel quite as much of the wind with trees to block it. But if I'm sitting in the woods in January in Pennsylvania, I'm still cold. Okay? So it wasn't so much to do with the warmth, but think about your food. Okay? In the summer, you're growing things. You're taking care of the fields and you're harvesting from the fields, and that's where your food's coming from. In the winter, where's most of your food coming from? Well, it's coming from the animals. It's coming from what you can hunt and cook and eat. So kind of going back to that idea of following the food, although staying maybe in the same basic area, but they were moving around. They were more nomadic than some of the other groups of eastern woodland Indians. So they lived in temporary villages in the warm months, set up villages in the forest in the cold months. Many Algonquin peoples held festivals related to the harvest or to religion. Do we do that? Of course we do. We have many celebrations that are related to those things. Think about harvest festivals. We have Thanksgiving, Thanksgiving originated as a harvest celebration. The Native Americans that met the Pilgrims in Massachusetts were Eastern Woodland Indians. So that idea of having a feast of Thanksgiving to celebrate the harvest kind of came together in that way. And we still have that celebration today. Festivals related to religion. Well, many of our holidays are related to religion, whether it's Christmas, Easter, Passover, Hanukkah. Many holidays, no matter what your religious beliefs are based on those different religious types of celebrations. Even Halloween began as a religious type of celebration. In some cultures, it still is. The Mexican culture with Dia de los Muertos, that's still more of a religious type of celebration. Okay. Celebrations included dancing, singing, drumming, and storytelling. Well, we have songs at our celebrations. We have parties. We have people that have feasts. All of those things. Stories. Christmas time, one of my favorite things is the Christmas specials on TV. That's just a more modern form of storytelling. So when I watch It's a Charlie Brown Christmas, or It's a Wonderful Life, or A Christmas Story with Ralphie and the Red Ryder BB Gun, those are all stories. That's all storytelling. Okay? So we see those things today, those ideas, even though this was a long time ago in a very different culture from our culture, some of those main things that unite us are still there. Okay? People haven't changed as much over the last few centuries as we might think. Okay? All right, we're going to stop there for today. Thank you so much, and we'll continue this lesson next time as we learn more about the Haudenosaunee people, and we'll be able to see some ways that they are similar to and different from the Algonquian people. Okay? Thanks so much. I'll see you next time.